People can be stranded in many different ways. On the side of the road, in an unfamiliar town, or even in hell. In this video, I will share with you 5 stranded horror stories. When I was 24 years old, I experienced something so strange, so scary, that I just had to write about it and share it with the world. It is absolutely true and was the scariest thing that has ever happened in my life. I was traveling at the time, going to visit my best friend who had moved a few states away from me to go to college. One day, I was driving in Ohio, if I remember correctly. I was on a long highway that stretched across the state when out of nowhere my car died. I shifted to the side of the road where I eventually came to a stop. I didn't run out of gas. I had just filled up at the last town. I tried starting my car, and I was very happy when it actually started. I was confused and was worried about why the hell it just died on me. As I started to pick up speed and get back on track, my car started making weird noises, and it sounded like something was grinding on something else. I looked up and saw a sign that showed that there was a gas station and food at the next exit. My car was moving, but with this grinding noise, I decided to get off the highway and take a look at it at the gas station. There were only 2 places off this exit that I could see. A gas station with 1 pump, and an old-looking diner not too far off next to it. I pulled into the gas station, and it looked closed. I checked my watch and quickly realized this was strange as hell. It was only 2:30 p.m. What kind of gas station closes before this time? I got out of my car and approached the glass door entrance to the station. I put my hands up and cupped the glass around my eyes to see inside. The place looked abandoned. It was obvious nobody was there, and I turned and looked around me. I felt a bit uneasy at this moment when I saw that no other people or cars were around me. What the hell? Where am I? I checked my phone, and of course, I had no service. I looked up at the sky, and it was white. The clouds were moving fiercely, and it was cold as hell outside. I decided to get back in my car and drive it over to the diner. When I reached this place, I thought for sure it was closed as well. But to my surprise, before I could even reach the door after getting out of my car, an old woman opened the door to the place and greeted me with a smile. She looked nice, and I was so relieved to see somebody else and maybe get some hot food in my stomach. She said hello and asked if it was just me, did I want a booth, blah blah blah. I told her yes, it was only me, and a booth sounded fine. This diner looked very old-fashioned, and there was no other customers inside. The woman showed me to my seat, and I scooted into the booth. I looked up at her, and she was wearing an old apron with stains all over it. Her teeth were old, cracked, and yellow. She had a pleasant voice though, and she seemed to be a very nice person. She handed me a menu and asked what I'd like to drink. I told her a Coke or Pepsi would be great, and she smiled and said she'd be right back. I sat there looking at this menu, and there was dirt on it. It looked like it had been sitting outside for years. I cleaned it off, and the food that was on it that was available was very basic. Burger, chicken sandwich, fries, salad. That was pretty much it. I decided to order the burger with some fries. A few minutes passed, and she hadn't returned with my drink yet. I was anxious to ask her if there was a mechanic around that could look at my car. A few more minutes passed, and I started thinking, what the hell is going on back there? I yelled out, "Hello?" in as nice a voice as possible. I got no response. At this point, I was annoyed, and I got up. I walked over to the door that led into the back cooking area and swung it open, about to ask where my drink was. To my surprise, the back of the diner was empty. There was no cooks, no fryers, no grills, nothing. The woman was nowhere in sight. It was obvious that this diner was not a running establishment, and I felt sick to my stomach. I started to walk into the back area when I heard the scariest, most evil old lady laugh I've ever heard. I stopped and backed up out the door into the front. I turned and walked out the door I came in from. I ran down the 3 steps and over to my car and got inside. Thank God my car started and I floored it out of there. As I was driving away, I looked into my rearview mirror and saw the woman standing in the middle of the road. I did everything for her. Please remember that, and I will start at the beginning. My wife and I, we woke in a suspended cage. All of our clothes were torn in places, but our bodies were fine. The cage was dirty and bare. The only thing in it was us. Outside the bars of the cage was an unending landscape of jagged rock, featureless except for the things that moved across its surface. People and things that were not people. This is how my wife and I woke up in hell. We were both rational, but rationality only lasts so long. We cried. We screamed for help. We moved past emotion. The cage was our home for a time, but eventually the hunger forced us to make a decision. The cage was unlocked. Why would it not be? It was hung from a ceiling with a massive chain, suspending us thousands of feet from the floor. The landing was not soft, but in hell, your body never stays broken. We learned this after the jump. We walked for a very long time. Many people around us had either given up, choosing to lay on the floor and moan, or they walked like we did, my wife and I. She kept me going, and I like to think I her. The things that were not people were the only true reminder of where we were, all different from the next. Some of them were massive, crushing people in their wake, and others worked like a hive, a single mind for countless bodies. All of them had teeth and claws, stained from use. There was a ceiling, so there had to be walls. It was a goal, at least. Something to do amidst the terrible hunger and pain. The ceiling was as flat as the land before us. Its only feature was a gaping hole that only the ragged, winged creatures could travel. A way out, maybe. I did everything for her. A long enough time, and you get used to anything. Hell almost seemed redundant. The sound of unending pain was boring, and the sound of bone cracking was common. Only 2 things needed avoided: the dark and the sacks. In the shadow of the greater creatures, people sunk into the floor, almost as if the dark came alive, their desperate fighting and screams lost to the total blackness. We only saw this twice. The other peril, the sacks, were large, unmoving, and made from burned flesh. My wife and I watched a man limp to one. It screamed at him, a piercing noise that drew us closer from our vantage point. I thought of a siren briefly before the man was sprayed with blood. The force of it sent him backwards. My right arm was also covered, and it began to itch with a force I thought impossible. Before my eyes, my arm became a deep red as it hardened like steel, my fingers sharpening. In my terror, I paid little attention to the monster that sprang from the place the man landed. The sacks were the forges in which demons were made. My arm never stopped itching, and my attempts to satisfy it with my left hand made my fingernails cracked and broken, but I had a way to provide for my wife. I used my arm to cut and maim people, stealing clothes, food, shelter. We forgot our pain by forcing it on others. I did everything and more for her. There was no way to keep track of time, but it was so long I forgot my name. The only thing I never forgot was my wife and my love for her. What got us in the end was one of those sacks, the sirens. The call of them was undeniable, at least to my wife. I tried to stop her, but she was always faster, and my arm made running impossible with its great weight. I followed her, screaming, begging her to listen to me, but she was coated in a sick blood of that thing by the time I got to her. Her body grew larger, her arms longer, almost tentacle-like. Her screaming deepened as her feminine form was lost to the changing. I cannot imagine the agony she was in. Her head grew horns. Her back grew great leather wings. Her legs fell off at the knee with a snap. Once her transformation was done, she gave me a knowing, pained look. I had tears in my eyes, the first true liquid I felt since we got down here. I was picked up by one of her new arms, and a flap of her wings took us up. I felt the wind ripping through me, and the roar of our fellow demons as we tore through the hole in the ceiling, darkness taking over us. My waking mind found myself sitting in the smashed car. The truck had hit us head on, sending my alcohol containers all over the interior. I knew they were mine because my wife did not drink. In the passenger seat, my wife's legs were crushed, my own arm hanging limply by the smallest amount of flesh possible. I looked into her dimming eyes, her irises bright red and glowing with fire, before she shut them forever. She did everything for me. I'll never forgive myself, and I don't think I should. I spent the night at my girlfriend's house one night and had to leave really early in the morning to go to work. So early, it was still dark outside when I left, and would be for a few more hours. She lived in a rural town about 60 miles from my house and work, and when I got in my car and started driving, there wasn't the usual street lights lining the roads to guide me. The only light came from my headlights. About 10 miles into my drive, my car started to slow down and eventually came to a stop. I first checked my gas, and it was almost full. I'm not very car trouble savvy, so I dug my phone out of my jacket pocket and swiped the screen. Nothing happened. I realized that my phone was dead, and immediately after that, I came to the realization that I had forgot to plug it in last night before we went to sleep. So here I was, stuck in my car, on the side of a rural street, pretty much in the middle of nowhere. I started thinking of things to do. I could start walking. No. Bad idea. It was dark as hell out here, and I wouldn't be able to see anything while walking. And on top of that, somebody could hit me. I concluded the only thing I could do was sit in my car and wait for daylight, which is a very stressful and scary thing to have to come to terms with. It was winter, and I started getting cold. I tried starting my car over and over, to no avail. I gave up and crossed my arms. I sat in the dark car, on the dark street, for about 10 minutes just looking into the darkness in front of me, before I squinted my eyes and noticed somebody walking toward my car directly in front of me. They were about 30 yards away. The only thing I could see was the outline of their body. They stopped walking right after I noticed them. I got really scared and just gazed at this outline for the longest time. In a sudden movement, they started walking again, but fast. In a few seconds, they reached my driver's side door and tried opening it. Did they think the car was empty? Holy hell, did they see me in here? I leaned away from the door and window onto the center console. After failing to open my locked door, they stood there for a moment and then very suddenly turned and walked away in the direction they came from. I was so confused and creeped out at this. Why would they walk back that way, the way they came? I sat there in the dark wondering what just happened, when all of a sudden I saw two headlights come on in front of me. The car was parked on the same side of the road as mine, but facing me. Had the person stopped when they saw my car? What would they do next? How did I not see them stop there? After a few moments, they started their engine and turned their car around, driving off down the road. A few hours later, the sun was rising, and a truck stopped next to me and asked if I was having trouble. I asked if I could use their cell phone, and with it, I called my girlfriend, who picked me up soon after. I was hauling a tanker from Amarillo, Texas to Phoenix, Arizona a few years ago. It's actually just a bit further than we're legally supposed to drive without a co-driver, but it paid well, and I didn't mind cooking the books a little. Now, I'd like to help paint the picture of my boring trip by describing the scenery. However, most of it was in a desert, miles and miles of nothing, but miles and miles. At night, there was no scenery, just darkness. Anyway, I was several hours into the trip, listening to an audiobook. Normally I tend toward more esoteric interests, sci-fi, paranormal, urban fantasy, or similar genres. But this night, I only had a book about a lawyer who went to a South American jungle to find an heiress and ended up getting dengue fever. But it was well written, and whoever the reader was, he had a pleasant voice, and I was actually enjoying it pretty well. When suddenly, bang! Blowout. Now, understand when you're hauling a tanker full of gasoline and something goes bang, for a brief moment you're scared shitless. But after a moment of realizing I wasn't already dead, I figured out what had happened and started looking for a place to pull over. Fortunately, that's not very hard to do in a desert. I got my rig pulled over, grabbed my flashlight, and hopped out to check on the situation. Bad news. It was two tires on the tanker's right passenger side that had blown. With one bad tire, I could limp to the next town. They don't call them 18-wheelers for nothing, but with two out of the same side, not safe. This was before cell phones were carried by everybody from old retirees down to kindergarten kids. At least, I for sure didn't have one. So there I was, on the side of the road, out in the middle of a desert, around 2 a.m., with a couple of flat tires. I'm a pretty big guy, and I was raised on a farm, out in the country back east, and I've always enjoyed hunting and camping, especially back then, but there's something that has always creeped me out about deserts at night. I'm not normally an anxious person, and heck, I even had a pistol in the cab, but the idea of waiting for a state trooper or Good Samaritan to come by didn't exactly fill me with glee. So I decided to just uncouple my truck and drive to the nearest town and get a hold of a mechanic. At this point, I was going to have to sleep anyway, because I couldn't cook the books with a mechanic and probably a trooper involved. I had just started to disconnect when I heard a voice. I admit I jumped slightly, but then realized it was coming from my cab. The CB. I hadn't heard anyone on it for a good while. Miles and miles of desert and all, but this might be a way to stay more or less on schedule if I could get some help. I hurried up to the front, and about the time I got up there, I heard the voice say, "They are coming." Something about either the voice or maybe just that line sent a shiver down my spine. The voice sounded odd, metallic. Sometimes a bad speaker or CB can cause something like that, so I tried to ignore it and asked, "What?" "They are coming." "Who's coming? Who is this?" The creepy voice almost yelled this time. "They are almost there. Beware." At this point, I was pretty spooked, so I grabbed my pistol. I got back on the radio to see if I could get any more info, and that's when I noticed that my CB was turned off. I had turned it off a few hours ago while listening to my audiobook. I turned it on and tried raising anybody, any way. Nothing. I couldn't see anything out in the desert as far as the headlights lit up, so I hopped down and started checking the area around me with my flashlight. Everything looked quiet. Too quiet. Sorry. Had to say that. I was just about to go finish disconnecting the tanker when I thought I heard something. Not really anything I could describe, just a noise. Maybe a hint of something moving. As I said before, I'm a hunter, and I'm pretty comfortable trusting my instincts. I know I heard something. I decided to climb a nearby rise and take a look from there. And this is the scariest moment I've ever experienced in my life. As soon as I got to the top of the little hill, I saw a spider the size of a person. It was heading my way. For several seconds, I just stared. Then I guess it noticed me and suddenly started running toward me. That broke my paralysis. I ran back to the truck, jerked the fifth wheel release handle, and scrambled into the cab. I took off without worrying about the cables or landing gear. I was sweating and cold at the same time, and I couldn't believe what I had just seen. My brain was still trying to tell me two things at once. One, I just saw a huge fucking spider, and two, there's no way I just saw a huge fucking spider. When I topped the next little rise in the road, the second part of my brain shut up, because walking right down the middle of the road like he owned it, maybe he did, was an even bigger spider. The first one I had seen was probably 6 feet wide, including the legs, and looked like a giant brown recluse, as near as I can recall. So, the body, while huge, was only like the size of a dog. This thing walking up the road looked like a giant tarantula, the size of, well, its legs were covering most of the 2 lanes. Its body was the size of a car, and I was almost on top of it. It's actually kind of interesting how the brain works. I had been a professional driver for several years. My muscle memory, conditioned response, and reflexes all came together to try and avoid an accident. But the part of my brain that was still processing thought was screaming, "Kill it!" Not that any of that mattered. I don't know how fast I was going at the time. I don't think I had worked all the way through the gears, but I'd guess I was doing around 50 miles per hour. An 8-ton vehicle traveling at 50 miles per hour doesn't stop until it damn well wants to. I jerked the steering wheel, but still hit it almost dead on. My first thought as I slid to a stop was that the giant tarantula... By the way, I've done some research and it actually looked more like a giant wolf spider. I remember it having green eyes that seemed to glow, but at the time I saw it, a giant hairy spider equaled tarantula to me. It had exploded when I hit it. I quickly looked around and I could sort of make out chunks and bits out of the darkness and some on my hood. I decided I didn't need to see any more and started back down the road as fast as I could. That's when the third heart attack provoking thing happened. I started noticing that the bits of spider on my truck started moving. Now, sure, I was rolling and the wind was moving, but something seemed off about the movements. Then I noticed that, how do I put this? The bits of spider had started turning into little spiders. Lots and lots of little spiders. Hundreds, thousands, hell, maybe hundreds of thousands. All on my hood. It didn't take them long to find little openings into the cab either. I was freaking out, but didn't want to stop out there in the desert, so I tried just squishing all of them that I could reach. I got bit several times before I realized there were simply too many to fight like that. Then I remembered that I had a fire extinguisher. Bit of advice: when using a fire extinguisher to fight an army of spiders inside the cab of a truck while heading down the highway at night, remember to open the window first. The good news is, it seemed to get them off of me. The bad news, I suddenly couldn't see or breathe. I managed to roll my window down and grab a breath of fresh desert air when I noticed a bizarre sight. Apparently, when I had tried to avoid crashing into the spider and slammed on the brakes to keep from losing complete control of the rig, I had managed to spin around. I was now heading straight back toward my tanker, and it had several giant spiders on it. At this point, I had several things going on. I was in a lot of pain from the multiple bites. I was having trouble breathing, from either the bites or the extinguisher, or both. And the sudden realization hit me that these things were an abomination to nature. I decided at that moment that I was going to kill them, and probably myself while I was at it. I hit the pedal to the metal, as they say, and aimed toward the tanker filled with all that lovely, explosive gasoline. At what I figured was the last second, I jumped out. I'm not sure I actually remember hitting the ground or the explosion, just an impression of pain and bright lights. To be honest, I was kind of surprised to wake up. There were the ruins of my tractor and the tanker and evidence of a huge explosion, but I didn't see any evidence of any giant spiders. After walking a couple of hours, I was picked up by a car and carried to the nearest town. I saw a doctor. He saw all the spider bites and gave me a couple of shots, some burn cream, and a prescription for something and sent me on my way. I talked to the local sheriff. He got a hold of local politician, businessman type, I forget who, not the mayor, but a councilman or something, and they took me out to the wreckage. Neither one said much. They asked me what happened, and I told them I had a blowout and lost control of the truck and wrecked. I wasn't about to tell them about giant spiders with no proof. I'd have lost my license and probably spend time in either jail or a hospital of some sort. Looking at it with them, it seemed pretty obvious that that's not what had happened. The sheriff called the ER and talked to the doctor who had seen me. At first, I thought they were going to arrest me or something, but after talking to the doctor, their attitude changed to something I couldn't quite place. Turns out the council guy was an insurance person, and between the two of them, they signed off on it as a wreck. I ended up getting a nice-sized check out of it, enough to cover a new tractor, but I decided not to be an OTR driver anymore after that. One final thing. At the last moment, as I was jumping out of the truck, I'm pretty sure I saw a spider tour? A sen spider? A half-man, half-spider on the tanker. The idea of giant spiders in the desert is scary enough, but if I saw what I think I saw, that suggests intelligent giant spider things out there. So, if any of y'all live around the petrified forest in Arizona, I'd move. Hello. I have a creepy as hell story to tell. I'm a full-time, cross-country big rig driver. I transport office furniture. One evening, I stopped at a trucker's rest that I wasn't too familiar with in Arkansas. The plan was to kick off the boots, eat something, and grab some sleep for a few hours, and then be back on the road at about sunrise. When I pulled into the rest stop, it was going on 1 a.m. I was dog-tired and was looking forward to the break. I parked my rig behind the bathrooms and saw that there was no other trucks parked here. I ate some food I had packed. I smoked a cigarette or two and stretched out in the back to go to sleep. I am very used to this whole deal, and I fell asleep quick. However, I'm not a deep sleeper, and if somebody comes messing around my rig, I hear it quite easily. That's exactly what happened. I opened my eyes at some point after I shut them and saw a young man standing on the steps on the passenger side looking in at me. I shouted to him, "What the fuck do you want? What are you doing?" The young man smiled at me and asked if I had any beer or liquor. This has happened to me a few times in my career, but it never spooked me like this. The young man looked like he was on drugs, and honestly, looked like trouble. He looked dangerous. I told him to fuck off like I normally would, but he didn't. He stood there and asked me again. I got up from my rack and reached behind the seat for my pistol. I showed it to him and told him he'd better get, or I wouldn't hesitate. He then suddenly jumped away and was gone. I got up and looked out the window he was at and couldn't see any cars or vehicles of any kind. I also didn't see the young man. It was like he came out of nowhere and then disappeared.